Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The 4-month EU referendum campaign was fought vigorously by both sides. Indeed, All Out War is the title of a new book about the EU referendum, and we'll be talking to its author, Tim Shipman, in a moment. But had the battle been lost by the Remain side before the campaign itself began? Because the deal that David Cameron came back with from Brussels didn't live up to voters' expectations. Here's a reminder of those months of EU diplomacy.
When we have negotiated that new settlement, we will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice.
What are you waiting for? Nobody's gonna show you how. Why wait for someone else to do what you can do right now?
Britain, I know you want this sorted, so I will go to Brussels. I will not take no for an answer. And when it comes to free movement, I will get what Britain needs.
Stop me now, don't need to catch my breath. I can go on and on and on.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
The sun has risen on an independent, united kingdom. And just look at it, even the weather's improved.
I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it. And I will do everything I can in future to help this great country succeed. Thank you very much.
Give it to me.
And we're joined now by the author of All Out War, here it is, and Sunday Times political editor Tim Shipman. Welcome to the programme. I'll put that there in front of you. So your thesis that David Cameron failed to meaningfully get anything out of that negotiation and Britain's relationship with the EU was the key to why he lost?
I think that's the view of a lot of people. I think there are people in Giesler's campaign in Vote Leave who think that, you know, the deal was nothing much and that made life easier for them to go on and win the referendum. I mean, there's two things here. There's what happened during the campaign, and there's the kind of context of 30 years of Euroscepticism and you know, a view across the Western world that globalisation has failed people. But if 600,000 people had changed their votes, we'd have had a different result. And there's a lot of things that David Cameron got wrong during that campaign that could have swayed some of those 600,000 votes.
I mean, why do you think David Cameron thought he could dramatically reform the EU, bearing in mind all the things that have been said, as you talked about, in terms of 30 years of Euroscepticism? I mean, it seems now blindingly obvious that they weren't going to give way on those key cornerstones of the EU.
Well, in terms of the practicalities of it, he never really put them on the spot. He asked them for certain things on benefits. He never actually put Angela Merkel on the spot and said, we're going to leave unless you do this on freedom of movement. Now, it's very likely that perhaps he wouldn't have got that, but he never actually forced them to choose. And, you know, lots of other things went wrong as well. You know, he ran a campaign that replayed the Conservative playbook from the Scottish referendum and from the general election, but he didn't have a proper campaign chief like Linton Crosby running the show. He didn't have the press on side echoing his messages in the way that they had done previously. And ultimately, you have to say that David Cameron put the unity of the Conservative Party ahead of winning the referendum. He never started from the end point of how do we win and work back from there. It was tactical changes all the way through.
Right, do you accept that, I mean, that's the claim that's made. The unity of the party was what it was all about, and actually he couldn't have really believed he could dramatically reform the EU, and so it was thus.
I don't agree with the last point, but I agree with a lot else of what Tim said. I think the fundamental weakness was that we didn't have a policy or an answer on immigration. And I think if we had done, then I think the result would have been quite significantly different. And I think the proposed benefit changes that were negotiated weren't enough to persuade the British people. I think there were other elements of the deal, actually, that were quite significant, but it was impossible to persuade the public of that at the time. I think that it is worth just pointing out that one thing happened between David Cameron's Bloomberg speech, where he declared that he wanted radical reform of the EU and then the negotiations, which was that the other countries then decided they didn't want treaty change. And he was forced to a negotiation that would be on things that would not require treaty change, which meant that it would be less radical.
Which was precisely the argument that George Osborne was making to David Cameron.
Saying he shouldn't do it.
He was violently against holding a referendum. He thought it would divide the Conservative Party, and he thought that there was a grave danger of it being lost. And the argument he made was keep kicking this into the long grass, and at the time when a treaty comes up, then we can have the argument, because that's the point, we'll have leverage. We didn't have leverage when he'd set a timetable 5 years in advance, and then when he came to it, the rest of them were too busy worrying about the migration crisis and about the continuing problems in the euro. They didn't want to talk to us about esoteric concerns about sovereignty.
I mean, why do you think George Osborne is his closest ally, and they were very close all the way through, David Cameron and him? Why wasn't he able to persuade David Cameron then against making that Bloomberg speech and holding the referendum?
I mean, Michael Gove was also making the same argument, but Cameron had taken the view that something had to be done. The problem was he decided something had to be done. He hadn't really worked out precisely how that was going to work through. And, at the point he made that argument in 2013, it was still 4 or 5 years away from when he thought it was going to be an issue for him. A lot of people I've spoken to for the book, though, think there's no way the Tories would have won the 2015 general election without making that pledge. And Osborne's argument then may not have worked. If we'd had a slightly different political environment without that referendum pledge, UKIP were on course to win the 2014 European elections, which they did. They could well have won some more significant, parliamentary seats than they managed to do so.
Right. Were you with George Osborne on not holding the referendum?
No, I was one of the people that was from way out urging that we should hold the referendum because we knew that there was this groundswell of concern, and that had been exacerbated by the cancellation of the referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, where people felt that they had frankly been betrayed. And I don't think we should fault David Cameron on his analysis. If you read what he said in his Bloomberg speech about what was going wrong in Europe, about people's concern about migration and so on, actually it's faultless. The problem was that the package then didn't live up to the reforms that were needed. And one can just as easily blame our EU partners for not recognising the forces present in this country and in their own countries.
Well, you could blame them, of course, but in the end...
Of the need for reform.
Right.
If they'd given us more, then I think we would still be in.
So, I mean, expectations may have been raised far too high. Well, they were raised far too high because, of course, he couldn't meet those demands. He was also relying, David Cameron, on Labour, perhaps getting more people out to vote in favour of Remain. If there had been an answer to immigration, would you still have been for leave?
For me, it wasn't so much the immigration, the deal which, if Cameron had come back and had got a recognition from the European Union that there would be it wasn't two-speed Europe, it was two-destination Europe. There'd be some countries who would never be part of the single currency. There would be different kind of relationships. I would have kind of fallen silent. No. And to me, I think the big error Labour made is that it registered itself as a Remain campaign party.
Well, I think we can argue about the two destinations because I think there was a debate about whether there would be a two-speed Europe at the time.
Yeah, but speed indicates the same endpoint.
Okay.
A recognition that some,
All right. Well, let's talk about Theresa May and Philip Hammond. But Theresa May now, obviously, as Prime Minister, because you say that Cameron wanted to go in with a tough negotiating start, but they didn't support him.
Well, there was one moment when he made this big speech on immigration, which actually set the tone for the rest of the immigration parts of the deal, which was a year in advance of when he actually did his deal. And there was a meeting where Cameron was pushing for an emergency break on numbers. Before that meeting and after that meeting, Theresa May backed him. But in the key meeting, it transpires that she and Philip Hammond basically said you can't go against Angela Merkel. And if she's not going to support this, which she was saying she wasn't, they didn't see the point in doing it. So it's just a key moment, where things might have turned different.
But what does it reveal to you in terms of how she will then carry out her negotiations now with Angela Merkel and others?
Well, it shows that she's quite practical and is also someone who is going to probably be quite cautious about how she goes about things.
Will she capitulate?
The politics of it are different now because when she was Home Secretary, she was in a position where she could stake out positions, but it was not ultimately her that was going to be the person in the firing line. It's very different when you're Prime Minister and the buck stops with you. As a Remain campaigner, if slightly half-hearted, Theresa May has got to prove to the Eurosceptics that she is going to take a tough line, and so far that's what she's doing. I think a lot of people in the Cabinet expect that she may be a little bit closer to Philip Hammond's sort of soft Brexit position than she is currently letting on, but
Right.
at the moment she has to stick to it, and she knows if she does not deliver something that looks like a pretty robust departure from the European Union, her own job is on the line, and that's very different from having David Cameron's job on the line.
Right. I mean, Gisela Stewart, something slightly different, because one of the other things you've written about was the sort of 24, 48 hours ahead of Boris Johnson's campaign collapsing, Michael Gove announcing his leadership. Michael Gove said he did that because he didn't think Boris Johnson was up to the job of being Prime Minister. Did you think Boris Johnson was up to the job of being Prime Minister?
What I thought would be a problem for the Conservative Party is that they would end up in a position similar to the Labour Party. If they had a ballot paper which had Boris Johnson and Theresa May on, they would have had one candidate which the party members liked and another candidate who the MPs would like. That, to me, just looking from the outside, I thought would have been their problem.
Tim Shipman, lots more to discuss, but another time. Thank you.
And then I'll declare for the leadership of UKIP next time.
Gosh, it's going to be a crowded room, isn't it?
I've been